My name is Faith, and at 35 years old, I find myself standing in my mother's sterile hospital room watching her sleep. 18 years ago, this woman abandoned me at a rest stop on Interstate 80 in Nebraska to teach me a lesson about respect. Now our roles have completely reversed, and she needs me, but I have become someone she never expected or wanted me to be. Before I share this incredible journey of abandonment and unexpected redemption, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please take a moment to like and subscribe if stories of resilience speak to your heart. At 17, I was everything a mother should have been proud of. I maintained straight A grades at Jefferson High School in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and I had dreams that reached far beyond our small city. I wanted to become a pediatrician to help children heal, though looking back now I realize I was the child who needed healing most. My mother Linda was 42, then a successful real estate agent who sold houses like she sold dreams, with a perfectly practiced smile and not an ounce of genuine warmth behind it. She wore her blonde hair in that specific way that screamed suburban perfection, never a strand out of place, just like everything else in her life had to be. Our colonial home on Maple Street was featured in the local magazine once, and she framed that article, hanging it in our entrance hall where everyone could see it. That was Linda, my mother always more concerned with how things looked than how they actually were. My father David might as well have been a ghost in our house. He travelled 4 days out of every week selling medical equipment to hospitals across the Midwest. When he was home, he buried himself in his study, emerging only for meals where he'd ask perfunctory questions about school while scrolling through emails on his phone. He threw money at problems instead of attention, as if a credit card could substitute for conversation, as if gifts could fill the void where guidance should have been. The cracks in our perfect facade started showing when I began dating Marcus. He was 19, taking classes at Kirkwood Community College while working at his uncle's auto shop. To me, Marcus represented everything real in a world of pretense. He had grease under his fingernails that he could never quite wash away, and he laughed with his whole body, not those polite little chuckles my mother performed at her networking events. He came from a family where people actually hugged each other without checking if anyone was watching first. Linda despised him from the moment she saw his 10-year-old Toyota Camry parked in our driveway. She called him trash, not to his face. Of course, she was too refined for that, but in those conversations she'd have with her wine glass after her third Pinot Grigio. She said he would drag me down, that I was throwing away my future for some boy who would never amount to anything. What she really meant was that he would embarrass her at the country club. The war between us escalated gradually, then suddenly. First, she started reading my diary, though she denied it, when I confronted her about knowing things I'd only written down. Then came the tracking app on my phone that she installed while I slept. She hired a private investigator, and I know this because I found the invoice in her desk drawer when I was looking for stamps. $800 a week to follow her own daughter around Cedar Rapids. The morning everything changed started like any other lie. Linda announced we were taking a college tour trip to the University of Colorado in Boulder. She said it would be good for us to spend quality time together, just mother and daughter, like we used to when I was little. I should have known something was wrong when she insisted I pack everything important, just in case we decided to extend the trip. She stood in my doorway watching me fill 2 suitcases, making sure I included my laptop, my favorite clothes, the jewelry my grandmother had left me. We loaded up her pristine white Lexus SUV, the one she washed twice a week, even when it was spotless. That car was like everything else in Linda's life, a prop in her perfect performance. As we pulled out of the driveway, I saw Mrs. Henderson from next door watering her petunias. Linda waved with that practiced smile, and I remember thinking how exhausting it must be to never let the mask slip, not even for a moment. The first few hours of the drive were filled with forced pleasantness. Linda had prepared a playlist of music she thought we both enjoyed, though it was really just what she considered appropriate. She talked about college applications, about the importance of choosing the right sorority, about how these would be the best years of my life if I just made smart choices. Smart choices in Linda's vocabulary meant choices that would photograph well in the Christmas newsletter. I texted Marcus under the dashboard, quick messages about missing him already, about the future we'd planned together. He wanted to open his own garage someday, and I could have my practice nearby. We'd have a small house with a big yard, maybe some chickens, definitely dogs. It was a modest dream, but it was ours built on something real instead of appearances. Linda kept glancing at my phone, making comments about how rude it was to text while someone was talking to you. She brought up my weight, mentioning how the freshman 15 was real and how important it was to maintain discipline. She talked about a girl from her sorority who'd let herself go and never recovered socially. Every word was a tiny needle precisely placed to hurt without leaving visible marks. We stopped for breakfast in Des Moines at a place called Honey's Kitchen. Linda smiled at our waitress, complimenting her on her efficiency, then turned to me and whispered about how some people were just meant for service positions. She ordered egg whites and dry toast for both of us without asking what I wanted. I watched other families in the restaurant, saw teenagers rolling their eyes at their parents, but with affection underneath it all, and I wondered what that must feel like. The landscape changed as we drove west, Iowa's green fields giving way to Nebraska's endless plains. Linda talked about her latest real estate deals, about the new family who'd moved into the Richardson place, about how their daughter was going to Yale. Everything was a comparison, a reminder of how I was falling short of her expectations. The car felt smaller, with each mile like the air was being slowly sucked out. We pulled into the North Platte rest stop at exactly 2 p.m. The July heat hit like a wall when I opened the car door, that dry Nebraska heat that makes you feel like you're standing in an oven. The rest stop was one of those modern ones, all glass and steel, trying to look like more than what it was, a place for travelers to empty their bladders and buy overpriced snacks. Linda suggested we both stretch our legs and use the facilities. She grabbed her purse, that designer bag she'd bought on our last trip to Chicago, and I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? She was my mother. Despite everything, despite the control and criticism, she was my mother. That still meant something to me then. The bathroom was crowded with summer travelers, families heading to Colorado for vacation, truckers, on long hauls, elderly couples and matching windbreakers, despite the heat. I waited in line, used the restroom, washed my hands twice, because the first time the soap dispenser was empty. I bought a bottle of water from the vending machine, counting out quarters from my wallet, and a pack of peanut butter crackers for later. When I walked back outside, the white Lexus was gone. At first, my brain couldn't process it. I stood there, water bottle sweating in my hand, scanning the parking lot. Maybe she'd moved to a different spot for shade. Maybe she'd gone to get gas and would circle back. I walked the entire lot, twice, my heart starting to pound in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I called her phone and it went straight to voicemail, not even a ring. I tried again and again. Other travelers started noticing me, this teenage girl pacing in the heat, phone pressed to her ear, obviously distressed. I could see them debating whether to approach that universal calculation of whether to get involved in someone else's crisis. At the 30-minute mark, my phone buzzed with a text from Linda. My hands shook as I opened it. The words blurred, then sharpened into focus. You think you're so grown up? Let's see how you handle real life. Find your own way home. This will teach you respect. I read it 5 times before it sank in. My mother had driven away and left me in the middle of Nebraska, 500 miles from home, in 100-degree heat, with $47 in my wallet and my phone at 30% battery. No charger. She'd made sure of that when she told me to pack it in my suitcase, the suitcase that was now speeding away in her Lexus. My legs gave out and I sat down hard on the curb, not caring that the concrete was burning through my jeans. A family walked by the mother, pulling her children closer, probably thinking I was on drugs or something. I wanted to scream at them that I was a straight-A student, that I'd never even smoked a cigarette, that my mother had just abandoned me like a dog on the highway. But I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up completely. An elderly couple finally approached. The Johnsons, they said their names, were from Minnesota, heading to see their grandchildren. The woman, Betty, had kind eyes behind thick glasses, and she sat down next to me despite the heat, despite her husband's obvious discomfort with the situation. She asked if I was okay, if I needed help, if someone had hurt me. I was too proud, too shocked to tell the complete truth. I said there had been a misunderstanding with my ride, that I was working on figuring it out. Mr. Johnson offered to let me use their phone to save my battery. I called my father first, knowing even as I dialed that it was pointless. Straight to voicemail. He was in Shanghai or Singapore or somewhere else that started with S saving lives with medical equipment while his daughter was abandoned at a rest stop. I left a message, trying to keep my voice steady, failing completely by the end. I called Marcus next, but his mother answered. She recognized my voice immediately, and her tone went cold. She said Marcus wasn't available and wouldn't be available, that they'd had a talk about his future, and I wasn't part of it. Then she told me Linda had called them that morning, explaining the situation, warning them not to enable my rebellious behavior. The betrayal hit harder than the abandonment. Linda had planned this, coordinated it, made sure every escape route was blocked. The Johnsons stayed with me for another hour, Betty insisting I drink some water, eat some of the sandwiches she'd packed. They offered to drive me somewhere. but where would I go? I couldn't ask them to drive 500 miles out of their way. I couldn't go home even if I could get there. Home was a woman who'd left me on the side of the road like garbage. As evening approached, a security guard informed me I couldn't stay overnight at the rest stop. It was against regulations. He was young, maybe 25, and I could see he felt bad about it, but rules were rules. He suggested I call family, call friends, call someone. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell him that family was who had done this to me. I spent my phone's dying battery calling relatives. My Aunt Patricia in Omaha didn't answer. My Uncle Robert in Kansas City picked up but said he couldn't go against Linda's wishes, that this was between mother and daughter. My grandmother was in a nursing home with dementia, thinking it was still 1985. Each call chipped away at whatever family meant to me. A truck driver approached as the sun was setting, offering a ride wherever I needed to go. He had a thick beard and kind eyes, but I'd heard enough stories to know that desperation makes people stupid. I declined politely and he shrugged, told me to be careful, that rest stops at night weren't safe for young girls alone, as if I had a choice about being there. Finally, with my phone at 5%, I called the one person Linda had told me never to contact. Catherine, my mother's estranged sister in Denver. They hadn't spoken in 7 years, not since some fight about their mother's will that I'd never gotten the full story about. Catherine answered on the second ring, and when I told her where I was when I explained what Linda had done, she said 4 words that saved me. I'm on my way. Catherine drove through the night to get to me. 3 hours from Denver to North Platte, though she made it in 2.5. I spent those hours sitting on a bench outside the rest stop, building watching headlights pass on the interstate, each one potentially being her, each one passing by. A maintenance worker gave me his jacket when the temperature dropped. Wouldn't take no for an answer, said he had a daughter my age. She pulled up at 3 a.m. in a Honda Civic that had seen better days, rust-eating at the wheel wells, one headlight dimmer than the other. Catherine looked nothing like Linda, though they were only 2 years apart. Where Linda was all sharp angles and perfect presentation, Catherine was soft curves and wild curly hair that had gone grey early. She wore pajama pants and a Denver Broncos sweatshirt, and when she saw me, she ran. Actually ran. The hug she gave me was the first genuine embrace I'd had from family in years. She smelled like coffee and cigarettes, and something floral, and she held me while I finally broke down completely, sobbing into her shoulder in a rest stop parking lot while truckers rumbled past. She didn't say everything would be okay. She didn't lie to me. She just held on. On the drive to Denver, the truth about my family came out in pieces. Catherine told me things Linda had worked so hard to hide, how their mother had struggled with mental illness, how Linda had her committed to get power of attorney, how she'd sold their childhood home and kept all the money. Catherine had fought it, hired a lawyer with money she didn't have, lost everything trying to get their mother proper care. Linda had cut Catherine off for marrying beneath her station. Those were the actual words she'd used. Catherine's husband, Miguel, was a mechanic, an immigrant from Mexico, who'd built his own business from nothing. To Linda, that nothing was all that mattered. Not the man who worked 16-hour days to support his family, not the love that was obvious in every photo Catherine showed me on her phone. But Miguel had died 2 years ago. Heart attack at 48, leaving Catherine with debt from his illness and a hole in her life that she was still trying to fill. She'd moved in with her friend Sandra to afford rent, downsizing from a house to a 2-bedroom apartment, selling everything that wasn't essential. Linda knew all of this and had never reached out, not even a card, when Miguel died. We arrived at Catherine's apartment as the sun was rising, painting the Denver skyline gold and pink. It was in an older building, the kind with radiator heat and windows that had been painted shut decades ago. But it was warm, really warm, not just the temperature, but the feeling. Books everywhere, plants on every surface that got light, photos covering the walls. Real photos of real moments, not the staged portraits that decorated Linda's house. Sandra was waiting with coffee and homemade breakfast burritos. She was a social worker, had been for 20 years, and she took one look at me and went into professional mode. She started documenting everything, taking photos of my condition, recording my statement, building a case file. She knew the system knew what would be needed if things got legal. That first meal in Catherine's apartment, sitting at a kitchen table that wobbled unless you put a folded paper under one leg, was the first time I'd felt safe in years. Catherine and Sandra didn't interrogate me about Marcus, didn't lecture me about my choices, didn't make me feel like I was failing some invisible test. They just fed me and let me exist without judgment. Catherine called Linda that morning. I could hear her through the thin walls, voice rising with each exchange. Linda was immovable. I would come home on her terms, submit to her rules, end things with Marcus, or I was no longer her daughter. Those were the choices: submission or exile. Catherine's response was immediate and fierce. "She's staying with me," Catherine said. "You're the one who's dead to us now." My father finally called back that afternoon, full of excuses and weak justifications. He was sorry things had escalated, but my mother knew best about these things. He couldn't undermine her parenting decisions. He would continue to deposit money in my college fund, but otherwise his hands were tied. I realized then that he wasn't trapped by Linda. He was freed by her. She was the bad cop, so he never had to engage at all. The decision to stay in Denver wasn't really a decision. It was the only option that didn't involve surrendering who I was. Catherine enrolled me at Denver East High School, a massive public school, so different from my private academy in Cedar Rapids. Sandra helped with the paperwork, emergency custody forms, documentation that would protect Catherine from Linda's potential legal retaliation. They converted Catherine's home office into my bedroom. It was tiny, just enough room for a twin bed and a dresser from Goodwill, but it was mine in a way my room at Linda's had never been. No one would search through my things here. No one would read my diary or track my phone or hire someone to follow me. The freedom was terrifying and exhilarating at once. That first night, lying on a mattress that squeaked with every movement, listening to sirens and street noise instead of suburban silence, I thought about the girl who'd gotten into Linda's Lexus that morning. She was gone, had been left at that rest stop along with any illusion that blood meant loyalty. But maybe that was okay. Maybe that girl needed to be left behind for me to find who I actually was. Denver East High School was a universe away from Jefferson Private Academy. 3,000 students instead of 300. Metal detectors at the entrances. Hallways that echoed with 5 different languages before first period even started. I was nobody that had no reputation to maintain or destroy, and that anonymity was the greatest gift I'd ever received. My first friend was Maria, whose parents had fled El Salvador's civil war when she was 2. She found me eating alone in the cafeteria, staring at my turkey sandwich like it held the secrets of the universe, and simply sat down and started talking. She didn't ask about my story, didn't probe for gossip. She just complained about calculus homework and invited me to her house for dinner. Maria's family lived in a duplex near Colfax Avenue, 5 people in 3 bedrooms, but their home had more warmth than Linda's mansion ever held. Her mother Rosa hugged me. The first time we met, really hugged me, not those air kisses Linda exchanged with her friends. Her father Carlos worked construction and had hands like sandpaper, but he built dollhouses in his garage for his granddaughter with the precision of a surgeon. They adopted me without question or ceremony. Sunday dinners became my tradition, helping Rosa make pupusas, while she told stories about her childhood, about the village where everyone knew everyone, about how family meant choosing each other every single day, not just sharing DNA. Maria's brothers taught me curse words in Spanish and how to fix a flat tire. Her sister showed me how to apply eyeliner without looking like a raccoon. At school, I discovered I had a voice. Not the carefully modulated one Linda had trained me to use, but my real voice. I joined the debate team, and my first topic was about parental rights versus child welfare. I argued with a passion that surprised everyone, including me, about how the system fails children who don't have visible bruises, whose wounds are all internal. Catherine was working 2 jobs to support us cleaning offices at night and doing bookkeeping during the day. I got a job at Shakespeare's Books, a dusty independent bookstore that somehow survived despite everything. The owner, Mr. Petrov, was a Russian immigrant who believed that books could save anyone if you found the right one at the right time. He paid me under the table and let me read during slow periods. I contributed every penny to household expenses despite Catherine's protests. It wasn't much, but it mattered to me to not be a burden to prove that taking me in wasn't a mistake. Sandra helped me apply for free lunch at school, for vouchers, for school supplies, for every program that could ease the financial strain. Pride was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. College applications were a minefield of explaining my situation without sounding like I was begging for pity. The counselor at East, Mrs. Martinez, had seen everything in her 30-year career. She helped me frame my story as one of resilience, not victimhood. She made calls to admissions officers explaining my circumstances, vouching for my character in ways Linda never would have. The acceptance letter from the University of Denver came in March. Partial scholarship work-study program loans that would follow me for decades, but it was mine. Catherine cried when I showed her real tears that she didn't try to hide. She said Miguel would have been so proud, that he always believed education was the only thing nobody could take away from you. Graduation day, I looked for Linda in the crowd. Some stupid part of me hoping she'd show up, that maternal instinct would override pride. She didn't come. But Maria's entire family was there, taking up a whole row cheering, like I'd won the Olympics when I walked across the stage. Catherine took so many pictures her phone storage filled up. Sandra brought a cake that said, "Future Doctor," even though I'd already decided I wasn't going to medical school. College was where I really found myself. I switched from pre-med to psychology, understanding, finally, that I didn't want to heal bodies, but minds, especially young minds, that had been broken by the people supposed to protect them. My professors saw something in me, an understanding of trauma that couldn't be learned from textbooks, and they nurtured it. I met James in my junior year in a criminal justice class where we debated rehabilitation versus punishment. He was studying law, wanted to be a public defender to give voice to people the system ignored. He didn't flinch when I told him about Linda, about the rest stop, about the family I'd built from scratch. He said his father had been an alcoholic who'd disappeared when he was 12. That family was just people who showed up. Our first date was at a food truck festival, nothing fancy, nothing that would have met Linda's standards. We ate Korean tacos and talked until the vendors started packing up. He kissed me next to my beat-up Toyota that I'd bought for $800, and it felt more romantic than any country club cotillion could have been. He saw me, really saw me, not as damaged goods, but as someone who'd been through fire and survived. My internship at the Lighthouse Youth Shelter brought everything full circle. I worked with teenagers who'd been kicked out for being gay, for being pregnant, for being imperfect, in ways their parents couldn't accept. I saw myself in every one of them, the shock of abandonment still fresh in their eyes, and I knew this was what I was meant to do. Graduate school was harder not academically, but emotionally. Studying family systems attachment theory, the psychology of abandonment, meant confronting my own wounds daily. My thesis advisor, Dr. Chen, pushed me to dig deeper to turn my pain into purpose. My dissertation on the long-term effects of parental abandonment on adolescent development won the department's award for excellence. James proposed the day after my thesis defense in the bookstore, where I'd worked through college. Mr. Petrov had helped him plan it closing early, filling the space with candles and wildflowers. The ring wasn't huge, wasn't what Linda would have considered appropriate, but it was perfect. Catherine was there. Sandra too, Maria and her family, everyone who'd chosen me when my blood family hadn't. The wedding was small in Catherine's backyard, which we'd spent weeks decorating with lights strung between the trees. Catherine walked me down the aisle to a song Miguel had loved, and I carried a photo of him in my bouquet. My father sent a check for $10,000 with a note that said he wished things were different. I donated it to the youth shelter. Building my practice wasn't easy. The first year I saw clients in a borrowed room at a community centre charging sliding scale fees that barely covered my loans. But word spread. Parents brought me their troubled teenagers, kids brought themselves when they turned 18, social workers referred the complicated cases that nobody else wanted. I specialised in what I understood: abandonment, trauma, family estrangement. The particular wound of being rejected by those whose love should be unconditional. My approach was different because I'd lived it. I could sit with a 17-year-old who'd been kicked out for dating the wrong person and say, I know I've been there, and mean it completely. The practice grew. First one associate, then 3, then a whole suite of offices in a building downtown. We took insurance, offered sliding scale, never turned away a teenager in crisis. The walls were covered with thank you notes from kids who'd graduated, gone to college, built lives their families said they'd never have. Each one was proof that Linda had been wrong about everything. Having my first child was terrifying. Charlotte came into the world screaming, and I was convinced I'd break her somehow, that Linda's poison was in my DNA waiting to emerge. But when the nurse put her in my arms, all I felt was fierce protection. I would die before I'd leave her at a rest stop. I would die before I'd make her feel like she wasn't enough exactly as she was. James was an incredible father-patient, in ways his own father had never been. Catherine was the grandmother Charlotte deserved, teaching her to bake, to garden, to question everything. Sandra became Aunt Sandy, the person Charlotte called when she needed advice she didn't want her parents to know about. Maria was her godmother, ensuring she grew up bilingual, bicultural, rich, in ways that had nothing to do with money. My second book, Abandoned at 17, A Therapist's Journey Through Trauma, hit the bestseller list. I did the morning show circuit, talking about resilience, about chosen family, about how the worst things that happen to us can become our greatest strengths. I never mentioned Linda by name, but anyone from Cedar Rapids would have known exactly who I was talking about. Speaking engagements followed. Universities, conferences, youth organizations. I stood in front of audiences and told my story without shame, watching faces in the crowd recognize themselves in my words. After every talk, kids would approach some in tears, saying nobody had ever put words to what they felt. Those moments made everything worth it. The birthday cards from my father came every year, generic Hallmark messages with checks I never cashed. No personal note, no phone call, just evidence that he remembered I existed one day a year. I saved them all in a box, not out of sentiment, but as reminders of what absence looked like when it wore the mask of presence. Catherine was diagnosed with lung cancer, my 32nd year. Those cigarettes she'd used to cope with stress had demanded their price. I took time off, spent every day at chemotherapy with her holding her hand, while poison dripped into her veins trying to kill the thing that was killing her. She talked about Miguel constantly, then about how she'd see him soon, and I didn't argue, even though I didn't believe in afterlife reunions. She died on a Tuesday morning in hospice, me on one side, Sandra on the other. Her last words were about how proud she was, how I'd become everything she'd hoped, how Miguel would have loved to see it. I gave the eulogy at her funeral, talking about how she'd saved me, when saving me could have cost her everything, how she'd shown me what family actually meant. I used my inheritance from Catherine to establish a foundation for abandoned youth, providing emergency housing therapy educational support. The Catherine Martinez Foundation, because she'd earned that recognition, earned having her name on something that mattered. The first kid we helped was a 17-year-old whose parents had left him at a truck stop in Wyoming. The cycle continuing, but this time with someone there to catch the falling. The call about my father came at 2 a.m. 3 years ago. Heart attack in his hotel room in Dallas, found by housekeeping when he missed checkout. The funeral director in Cedar Rapids needed someone to make arrangements, and I was still listed as next of kin. The irony wasn't lost on me that death had finally forced him to need something from me. I flew to Cedar Rapids for the funeral, my first time back since that morning Linda drove me away. The city looked smaller, sadder, like a movie set for a life that had never really existed. James came with me, Charlotte and our son Thomas staying with Maria. I needed him there, needed someone to remind me who I'd become when surrounded by who I'd been expected to be. Linda looked like a caricature of herself at the funeral. 18 years of Botox and fillers had created a face that couldn't quite express emotion anymore. Her black designer dress hung on a frame that had become brittle with age and wine. When she saw me, something flickered in her eyes, recognition, regret, resentment, all mixed together, but her face couldn't show any of it. She approached during the viewing when I was standing alone, looking at my father in his casket, wondering if he'd ever had a moment of clarity about the life he'd wasted in airports and hotels. Linda stood beside me, too close, her perfume the same suffocating cloud it had always been. We should put the past behind us, she said, like 18 years was just a small disagreement we'd had. My response came out calmer than I felt. The past made me who I am, I said. I wouldn't be here without it. She flinched like I'd slapped her, probably the first genuine reaction I'd seen from her in decades. She started to say something else, but James appeared at my elbow and she retreated to her circle of real estate friends who'd come to support her in her time of grief. The reading of the will was where everything unraveled for Linda. My father, it turned out, had been living a complete double life. Another family in Seattle, a woman named Patricia, and 2 sons, teenagers, who looked more like him than I ever had. He'd been married to her for 12 years, which meant he'd been a bigamist for most of them. The house in Cedar Rapids was all Linda got. Everything else went to his real family, the one he'd chosen instead of tolerated. Linda's rage was volcanic. She screamed at the lawyer, threatened lawsuits, accused everyone of conspiracy. But the paperwork was ironclad. David had been meticulous in his deception, creating trusts and corporations to hide assets, moving money in ways that spoke to years of planning. He'd been leaving Linda long before he actually left, just too cowardly to do it honestly. The real estate market crashed 6 months later, taking Linda's business with it. She'd over-leveraged, borrowed against properties that were suddenly worth half what she owed. Her reputation built on those perfect presentations crumbled when she couldn't deliver. Clients sued. Partners distanced themselves. The woman who'd spent her life maintaining appearances suddenly had nothing left to maintain. Pride prevented her from asking for help. She'd burned every bridge with family, alienated every friend who might have cushioned her fall. I heard updates through distant cousins, through people who still remembered me from high school. Linda lost the house, moved to an apartment complex near the interstate. Started working at a department store selling perfume to women who used to be her clients. The drinking got worse. It had always been there, hidden behind wine clubs and cocktail parties, but now it was just bottles of cheap vodka and no reason to stop. A DUI cost her license. A second one cost her job. She was becoming what she'd always feared, most ordinary, struggling, visible in her imperfection. I felt everything and nothing about her decline. Satisfaction that karma had finally arrived. Guilt about feeling satisfaction. Anger that it had taken so long. Sadness for the mother she could have been if she'd been capable of love without conditions. My therapist, yes, even therapists need. Therapists helped me understand that these contradictions were normal, that you could grieve someone who was still alive, mourn a relationship that had never really existed. Then 6 months ago, the call came. Linda had suffered a stroke in her apartment. The neighbours had heard her fall, called emergency services. She was alive but damaged left side, partially paralysed, speech affected. The hospital called me because my father had never updated his emergency contact forms. Even in death, he was still making me responsible for his messes. I stood in the doorway of her hospital room for a long time before entering. She looked small in the bed, vulnerable in a way she'd never allowed herself to be before. When she opened her eyes and saw me, fear flashed across her face. She thought I'd come for revenge to abandon her like she'd abandoned me, and honestly, the thought had crossed my mind. But I'm not her. I've spent my entire adult life becoming not her. So I entered the room, sat in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, and asked the doctor about prognosis, treatment options, rehabilitation needs. Linda watched me with confusion that had nothing to do with her stroke. She couldn't understand why I was there, why I was helping what I could possibly want from her now. The truth was, I didn't want anything. I was there because it was the right thing to do, because despite everything, she was a human being in need. Not my mother, that relationship had died at a rest stop in Nebraska, but a person who deserved basic dignity even if she'd never offered it to others. I arranged for her transfer to a rehabilitation facility, not the best one that would have been too generous, but a decent one, where she'd receive proper care. I visited Linda once a week at the Sunrise Rehabilitation Centre, always on Tuesday mornings when my schedule was lightest. The facility was adequate, clean, professional, nothing like the luxury she would have demanded in her previous life. Her room was shared with another stroke patient, a retired teacher named Dorothy, who had family visiting, constantly highlighting Linda's isolation. The first few weeks we didn't really talk. Linda's speech was still affected, but more than that, she didn't know what to say to me. I'd become successful beyond anything she'd imagined, just not in any way she'd planned. I was Dr. Faith Morrison, now published author, respected therapist, mother of 2 beautiful children she'd never met. The daughter she'd tried to break had become unbreakable without her. Charlotte and Thomas met their grandmother on a rainy Thursday. I hadn't planned it, but Charlotte's school was closed for teacher conferences, and James was in court. I brought them with me, these pieces of my heart, walking into the room where my own heart had been broken. Charlotte, 8 years old and fearless, walked right up to Linda's bed and introduced herself. "Your mother left you at a rest stop," she said, matter of fact. That wasn't very nice. The honesty of children is brutal and beautiful. Linda's face crumpled, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her since the stroke. Thomas, only 5, climbed onto my lap and asked if the sad lady needed a hug. When I explained she was their grandmother, he looked confused. "But grandmas are supposed to be nice," he said. And I didn't correct him because he wasn't wrong. Linda watched me with my children, saw how Charlotte leaned into me while reading how Thomas brought me pictures he'd drawn, how they trusted me completely. She saw what she'd missed, not just with them, but with me, all those moments when I'd needed a mother and got a critic instead. The tears that rolled down her face were silent but steady. During one visit, she managed to say she was sorry. The words were slurred but clear enough. I told her I wasn't the one who needed to hear it. She needed to tell herself to sit with what she'd done to understand it fully. Apologies without comprehension were just noise, and we'd had enough noise between us to last several lifetimes. I brought her my books, both of them, and left them on her nightstand. Whether she read them or not was her choice, but I wanted her to see what had grown from the seeds she'd planted in cruelty. Other patients started recognizing me from my TV appearances, asking for autographs, telling Linda how lucky she was to have such an accomplished daughter. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Catherine had visited once before she died, the sisters' final conversation. I waited in the hallway but could hear Catherine's voice steady and clear. "I forgive you, Linda. Not for you, but for me. I've been carrying this anger for too long and it's heavy, so I'm putting it down. What you do with yours is your choice." Linda had sobbed, then ugly sounds that might have moved me if I hadn't heard myself make those same sounds at 17. When Linda's insurance ran out, the social worker called me about next steps. State facilities were the only option unless someone could pay privately. Linda panicked, begged with her eyes, since words were still difficult. She'd seen those places, knew what they meant, final stops for people with no one left to care. I could have walked away, then let the state take over, let her experience true abandonment. Instead, I arranged to cover the costs for her to stay at Sunrise. Not because I forgave her, forgiveness isn't owed to everyone who hurts us. Not because I loved her, that child's love had died in Nebraska, but because I could. Because it was the opposite of what she would have done. Because my children were watching me choose compassion over cruelty, even when cruelty would have been justified. I stopped visiting after that. My obligation was financial, not emotional. Linda had care, dignity, safety more than she'd given me. But that was the point. I wasn't her. I would never be her. Every check I wrote was a reminder that I'd survived. Her succeeded, despite her become something beautiful from the ashes she'd tried to leave me in. The facility sent updates. Linda was improving slowly, speech therapy, helping physical therapy, returning some mobility. She watched my appearances on morning shows from the common room television. Other patients told me she'd cry when I talked about resilience, about chosen family, about how the worst things that happen to us can become our greatest strengths if we let them. One morning, she watched me on the Today Show discussing my new foundation for abandoned youth. The interviewer asked about forgiveness, whether I'd forgiven my mother for what she'd done. I said forgiveness wasn't about the person who hurt you. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of their actions. It was about choosing not to let their cruelty define your capacity for kindness. Linda must have understood then what karma really meant. Not punishment, but consequence. She'd tried to teach me a lesson about respect by abandoning me, but the lesson I'd learned was about resilience. She'd tried to control my future by cutting me off from support, but I'd found support in unexpected places. She'd wanted me to need her to come crawling back, but I'd learnt to stand without her. The ultimate irony was complete. Linda was surrounded by professional care she didn't deserve, paid for by the daughter she'd thrown away, while that daughter was surrounded by genuine love she'd earned through her own choices. Linda had created exactly what she'd feared most, an independent, powerful woman who didn't need her approval, didn't need her love, didn't need her at all. Today, I sit in my office, the one overlooking the Denver mountains, successful beyond anything that frightened 17-year-old at the rest stop could have imagined. There's a photo on my desk of Catherine taken just before she got sick, her wild grey hair catching sunlight. Next to it, a picture of my chosen family at Charlotte's birthday party, Maria's family mixed with James's. Sandra in the centre, everyone who'd caught me when Linda let me fall. There are no childhood photos, no evidence of the first 17 years of my life. That girl, the one who got into Linda's car that morning, believing mothers protected their daughters, she stayed at that rest stop. She had to die for Faith to be born, and Faith is who I choose to be every single day. Sometimes I drive past that rest stop on trips to see Maria's parents who moved to Nebraska to be closer to grandchildren. It's still there, modernized now, digital displays showing weather and traffic. I took Charlotte and Thomas, once showed them the bench where I'd waited for Catherine. This is where my real life began, I told them. Charlotte asked if I'd been scared. Terrified, I admitted, but sometimes the scariest moments lead to our greatest strengths. My practice has grown to 30 therapists, now 3 locations across Denver. We've helped thousands of teenagers navigate family trauma, abandonment, the particular pain of being rejected by those whose love should be unconditional. The foundation Catherine inspired has provided emergency support to over 500 youth in crisis, kids left at rest stops, kicked out for being gay, abandoned for not meeting impossible expectations. Every year, I sponsor a full scholarship for an emancipated minor at the University of Denver. The recipients often come to dinner, sitting at my table with my family, sharing their stories of survival. Charlotte and Thomas listen with wide eyes, understanding gradually how fortunate they are to have parents who love them for who they are, not who we need them to be. Linda still sends letters I don't open. They pile up in a drawer, unopened testimonies to words that no longer have power over me. Maybe she's apologizing. Maybe she's still angry. Maybe she's rewriting history to make herself the victim. It doesn't matter. Those letters are about her need to speak, not my need to listen. The stroke has progressed. She's in a wheelchair now, speech limited to simple phrases. The facility says she's compliant with treatment, polite to staff, isolated, but not difficult. She watches my segments when I'm on television, tells anyone who'll listen that I'm her daughter. The other patients don't believe her, because surely someone with a daughter like that wouldn't be so alone. James asked me once if I regret not reconciling, not offering the forgiveness that might give us both peace. I told him peace isn't found in forgiveness forced by obligation. It's found in accepting that some relationships are too broken to repair, that some people are too dangerous to let close, that DNA doesn't entitle anyone to destroy you repeatedly. My children know they have a grandmother who made bad choices. They know she hurt me when I was young, that she's sick now, and I help her, because it's right, not because I love her. They understand boundaries, consequence the difference between kindness and enablement. They'll never wonder if they're enough, because I tell them every day that they're exactly who they're supposed to be. The teenage girl abandoned at that rest stop died that day, but her death gave birth to someone stronger. Linda created exactly what she'd feared, an independent woman who didn't need her approval or her love. But in trying to break me, she forged something unbreakable. In teaching me about cruelty, she taught me to choose kindness. In showing me conditional love, she taught me to love unconditionally. I think about karma differently now. It's not cosmic revenge or divine justice. It's the natural consequence of our choices rippling out into the world. Linda chose control over connection, appearance, over authenticity, pride over love. Those choices left her alone, abandoned by her own actions long before life abandoned her. She planted seeds of cruelty and grew a garden of isolation. But I planted different seeds. Every teenager I've helped, every family I've kept together, every child who knows they're loved unconditionally, those are my seeds. Catherine's love, Maria's friendship, James's partnership, my children's trust, those are what grew from the ashes Linda left me in. The girl at the rest stop became a woman who helps other girls at their own rest stops. Your worst moment doesn't define you, I tell my clients, your response does. Someone's attempt to break you might be exactly what makes you unbreakable. The family that abandons you leaves space for the family that chooses you. The love you don't receive teaches you about the love you deserve. Linda is still alive, existing in that rehabilitation centre, watching the life she could have been part of on television. Maybe that's the cruelest karma of all, not death, but witnessing what you've lost, understanding, finally, that power was never about control, but about connection. That strength was never about breaking others, but about lifting them up. I wouldn't change anything about my story. That rest stop in Nebraska wasn't where I was abandoned. It was where I was set free. Linda thought she was teaching me a lesson about respect, but she taught me about resilience. She thought she was punishing me, but she was releasing me. That 17-year-old girl had to be left behind for this 35-year-old woman to exist. Do you have someone in your life who tried to break you, but made you stronger instead? Share your story in the comments below. If this message of resilience resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories of triumph over trauma. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their worst moment can become their greatest strength. Thank you for joining me on this journey from abandonment to abundance. Remember, you are not what happened to you, you are what you choose to become.